Given how much the regulars love exploiting trivial mistakes to question one's credibility, I'm amazed that none of Webb's adoring fans have picked up on that mistake.
Jarrah's confusion on which stations received the Apollo 11 transmissions is minor compared to the larger fallacy that Jarrah commits by assuming that Parkes was the only station in the world to receive all the video signals from the moon for all Apollo missions.
This is a straw man on Webb's part. Never in my Exhibit D series did I claim that Parkes was the only one to receive all the video signals from all the moon missions. I simply said that Australia was the only one to receive the Apollo 11 moonwalk videos. Yes, Goldstone also allegedly received signals too, but they are owned by NASA. The Australian radio telescopes, such as Parkes and Honeysuckle Creek, are often presented as the ultimate independent verification for the Apollo missions. But they are not independent observatories. All the Australian tracking stations are part of NASA's Deep Space Network.
Now, Australia has a fine tradition of keeping the lines of communication with space open. So I caught up with NASA's man down under, Glenn Nagle, to find out about some of our great achievements, which include everything from Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon to the current Phoenix mission on Mars.
000 9 or 8 030.
I'm at the Deep Space Complex at Tidbinbilla, just outside of Canberra, and here's where they track all the spacecraft in the solar system, right from the quite close, like the SOHO probe that's monitoring the sun, through to the most distant. Voyager 1, which is now past all the planets, heading towards the outer solar system.
Everything is nominal for ASC.
When you consider just how far away some spacecraft are, it's remarkable we can pick up any trace of them at all.
Well, if we take, for example, our most distant spacecraft right now, that's Voyager 1. It's been out there for over 30 years, 16 billion kilometres from home. Its signal gets back to us here at 1/20 billionth the amount of power that a watch battery generates.
This facility is one of 3 in the world that make up NASA's Deep Space Network.
To have a network that can provide communication to all the spacecraft anywhere in the solar system, you need them separated by about 1/3 of the world each. So a good 120 degrees line either side runs nicely through Australia. Ended up being the best spot.
Now this dish is probably the most famous here, is it?
Yeah, this is the dish originally from Honeysuckle Creek that actually returned the very first images of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the surface of the moon way back in July 1969.
Roger, Bruce, we watched it all.
The dishes at Tidbinbilla have tracked many spacecraft since those early days.
Touchdown signal detected.
Their big mission at the moment is the Mars Phoenix lander.
And emit sequence initiated.
And whereas previous missions have landed on the surface and we've driven across that surface, this is a chance to actually dig up that surface.
Especially now they've found water on the planet. And if Mars is ever to host a glass house full of asparagus and beans, it's likely the pictures will be beamed back to Earth through Australia's Deep Space Tracking Station.
Roger, copy, loud and clear.
2 other major radio stations are also typically sighted. Goldstone Tracking Station in California and the Madrid Deep Space Communications Complex. But these 2 stations make up the other parts of NASA's Deep Space Network. Because it was NASA's radio telescopes tracking NASA's spacecraft, it was essentially the metaphoric equivalent to the fox guarding the henhouse. Webb conveniently ignores this to accuse me of
ignoring all the other Apollo missions and implying that Parkes was the only station that received any television signals from any Apollo mission is another fallacy of omission.
The only fallacy of omission I can see is Webb's omission of A, the fact that I corrected myself regarding Goldstone also allegedly receiving the Apollo 11 moonwalk telecasts, and B, his omission of the fact that I acknowledged that Goldstone and Madrid are also alleged to have tracked Apollo. Whether it was just Australia, or Goldstone, Madrid and Australia tracking the signals, it's immaterial. All are NASA facilities.
And by concentrating on only the television signals, Jarrah ignores the fact that there were voice communications and telemetry coming from the command module and lunar module that could be intercepted by anyone, including the Soviets, and any savvy amateur radio operators who simply had to point a dish antenna toward the moon and listen in.
Firstly, it's not simply a matter of pointing your dish and listening in. Listening in requires both your dish to be precisely aimed and tuned to the correct frequency. In my original video, I pointed out that the Soviets don't use the 2 GHz band used by Apollo, and the FCC doesn't allocate ham operators this frequency. Going by these regulations, I pointed out that hams could not possibly have picked up Apollo's signals. After my video was posted on Joe Rogan's forum, members posted links to various radio hams who claimed to have tracked Apollo, namely Paul Wilson, Richard Nadel, and 7 Gran. I read deep into all of their testimonies, and they all had one thing in common. None of them can attest to having tracked these vehicles all the way to the moon and back, as trolls like Shane Killian have falsely claimed.
As well as hundreds of amateur astronomers and radio enthusiasts who claim to have tracked the Apollo spacecraft all the way to the moon?
In fact, it wasn't until Apollo 15 that they even picked up voices. The hams can only attest to having tracked Apollo when it was on or near the moon, and if they're lucky, a few hours of return signals on the ride home. This is nothing that can't be pulled off with an unmanned craft to either relay data from low orbit or transmit pre-recorded information. The last 2 sources cited at Joe Rogan's forum were Carnarvon Tracking Station and Honeysuckle Creek, both of which are NASA facilities and thus should not be counted as independent verification. Just to give a quick recap, Paul Wilson claims to have picked up signals from Apollos 10, 12, 14 and 15 when they were in lunar orbit, plus a few hours of signals during Apollo 15's return voyage. He also claims to have picked up Apollo 16 just before it entered lunar orbit and while it was in lunar orbit. Richard Nadel claims he picked up Apollo 15 in lunar orbit and some of the signals broadcast on the ride home. 7 Gran claims he picked up Apollo 17 during its various passes over his head, then for reasons unknown stopped tracking the signals and resumed only when the craft was in lunar orbit. Further, it wasn't until Apollo 15 that Wilson actually received voice signals, and the FCC declared it illegal for hams to inform the world of any communications not intended for public view. In a nutshell, the average ham is typically not allocated the frequency band used by Apollo. And it seems that none of the hams who found a way to tune their dishes to Apollo's signal can attest to having tracked these vehicles all the way to the moon and back. Given that these guys tracked very little data, if any, it's possible that these signals they received were from unmanned probes respectively on the moon and in lunar orbit, which either broadcasted pre-recorded signals or relayed transmissions that were beamed to them from Earth orbit. And given that no one was tracking these probes all the way to the moon, who would know if they were already up there in advance? And let's not forget, with the FCC policing what hams can and cannot disclose to the public, the truth behind Apollo is as good as buried. Just how many hams do you suppose have evidence of a hoax and are keeping silent over fear of prosecution? Recently, I met up with one such ham operator. Would you believe it? The same story as before.
I was a kid when the first moon landing happened, but actually I was a total geek, and I've got this little radio telescope in my backyard, and with this little radio telescope I could see the Milky Way, I could see the sun. That's about it. One thing I did get was Apollo 13, and I could actually listen with my little radio telescope to the astronauts talking above the telemetry. So if it is all stage managed, it's a pretty elaborate thing, because I know there were people up there in space, right? And so, okay, I don't know whether they actually set foot on the moon. Apollo 13 itself never went to the moon. But I certainly know there are people up there in space. That wasn't stage managed, that was real. I have first-hand experience that that was real.
Where was Apollo 13 when you picked up that
signal?
Is it
in Earth orbit? This is quite close to the Earth, yeah.
Did you track it like all the way to the moon and back?
No, I didn't have the sensitivity for that.
Okay.
But they were definitely in space.